Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 16, which is the second of two lectures about climate change. And amazingly, we've just about reached the end of the term. This second to last lecture of new material addresses more specifically the Antarctic connection to climate change. The first half of this lecture talks about how Antarctic research has allowed an extensive record of Earth's climate to be established, primarily via the discovery of ice cores. During the second half of the lecture, I'll talk about the effects of climate change on Antarctica, how it has caused ice sheet collapses, declines in the population of krill, and other effects. So I want to remind you that lecture quiz number 2 is open and it is due on Sunday, May 30th. I had a review session for it today, and the recording for that is uploaded. You get 30 minutes to take the quiz, and it is 12 questions, which are 10 multiple choice and true or false, and then 2 short answer questions. That does not cover either this lecture or lecture 15. It covers lectures 11 through 14, as well as the relevant clips of Encounters at the End of the World and Antarctica: A Year on the Ice that I assigned, and then you'll want to make sure that you've skimmed the Shackleton excerpt. Reading assignment number 2 is due next Sunday on May 30th, and be sure to turn in the Antarctic Exploration Lab by Friday. We also have 2 graduate students talking about their research on Thursday, May 20th at 2:00 p.m. Han Xiao and Lun Xiang will be talking about their research related to earthquake waves. And then we have another talk hosted by Martin van de Ende, a visiting researcher, on Friday. This is one of the Santa Cruz seminars. So these are all opportunities for you to attend, hear a talk about geology, and write an extra credit report. For those of you looking to add points to your midterm or retroactively, or looking to build some buffer points for the final exam. And I'll have some more announcements more closely detailing the assignments in the second half of the lecture, because there is slightly less lecture material proper for the second half. So the first half will be devoted to talking about Antarctica's contribution to climate records, and then lecture 16B will be about the effects of anthropogenic climate change on Antarctica. So I've been talking about climate change in terms of it being something that is understood to be outside of what would be considered to be the normal range for climate, for temperature, for average atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and average rates of ice sheet melting. All of these have been established to be happening at rates that are unusual for what would be expected during an interglacial period of an ice age. But how do we know what is usual? How do we know what is the normal range? And we obviously can't really go back in time, and we can't necessarily go back in time to set up weather stations and measure climate over the course of, say, the year 1500. However, we do have some useful tools available to us, and one of those actually does involve literally looking at trapped air from past times. And in a way, we can sample the air. That's going to be a big topic of this lecture. However, in general, the science to determining what the humidity and temperature and wind patterns and other aspects of climate used to be like is dependent on what we know as what we call proxies, indirect studies that measure how something changes, like the thickness of varves or tree rings or cave formation growth, and then we link that to changes in climate over time. And the science to determining this is known as paleoclimatology. And paleoclimatologists study how greenhouse gas emissions, Milankovitch cycles, plate tectonics, and other factors have affected the climate in the past, and what consequences that has had for life on Earth. And you might have heard the term proxy before in a financial context or a business context. Somebody sends a proxy to a meeting to conduct business and vote for them because they can't actually physically be there themselves. And we no longer have the whole ancient atmosphere to sample, but we can find evidence that can give us clues as to what the climate in ancient times was like. And paleoclimatology very heavily relies on those proxies, but the cool thing about Antarctica is that it gives us one bit of data that is actually letting us actually sample ancient air and make direct observations from it. Excuse me. So we'll first talk about the various proxy methods that are important for helping scientists make educated guesses about past climates. And we actually touched on one of them earlier, and those are varves. And remember that if glaciers are present, the meltwater that's melting from the glacier will carry some fine-grained sediment, known as outwash, into lakes. And in lakes that are fed by glacial runoff, we'll see a pattern. In the summer, when the glaciers are melting more, the lake will be full of light-colored outwash that has a lot of quartz in it, quartz that's been eroded by the glaciers. But in the winter, the lake will instead be dominated by dark-colored organic matter from the lake, since the glacier is melting less and less sediment is coming off of it. And we can find varves in sedimentary rocks. The lake sediments become sedimentary rocks, and we can find these rocks and study them. We can study varves to see how glaciation changes during the time in which the sedimentary rocks were formed. If a varve pattern is present, and as we go from older samples to younger samples, we observe that the black stripes are getting wider, we can make a guess that it was getting colder because winter was colder and longer, meaning that during more of the year, there was relatively little glacial runoff, and thus the lake sediments were dominated more by organic matter as opposed to glacial outwash. Another proxy we can use is ocean sediments. And one reason we look at ocean sediments is we want to look for fossils of foraminifera. And foraminifera are a type of phytoplankton. They're one of the types that I spoke about in the last lecture that build their little shells out of calcium carbonate. They're single-celled, but they actually have mineralized cell walls that have calcite, that have calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate actually has oxygen in it. Calcium carbonate is CaCO3. And as we will find out, oxygen isotopes are very useful for learning about glaciers and learning about climate as a whole. In addition, cave formations are also made of calcium carbonate. And the cave formations are known as speleothems more broadly. Speleothems includes stalactites and stalagmites, as well as columns and Bacon. And yes, there is a cave formation known as Bacon, along with just the various other formations you find in Carlsbad Caverns or Mammoth Cave or Kartchner Caverns or other limestone caves. And we can study the oxygen in this carbonate to learn about the isotopes and thus make conclusions about the climate during the time in which those cave formations were built up. Now, you might also have heard how tree rings can be used to tell a tree's age, because many long-lived tree species produce a pattern of rings. The cool thing is that we can also use tree rings for climatology. What happens is that the lighter layers alternate with dark layers, and the light layers form in the spring and the early summer, while the darker rings, like you can see here, the dark orange rings, form during late summer and fall. And with some calculations, it's possible to determine how old the trees are. And it's also possible to look at the relative thickness of the layers and observe how the seasons changed, whether summers were longer or shorter, whether it was wetter or drier. And this is actually how scientists have made observations about the conditions that led, for example, the ancestral Puebloan people of the Southwest to disperse from their cities. It appears that it was because of drought, and we've been able to pinpoint that a drought occurred around the time when those cities were abandoned using tree rings, using rings from trees that have been alive for hundreds or even a couple of thousand years. And we also talked about plant fossils. And we talked about plant fossils when talking about plate tectonics, and it turns out that the same distribution patterns that help us unlock the mystery of plate tectonics can also tell us about past climate. And if plants are known to be associated with a particular ecosystem, a particular environment, the presence of particular plant fossils can be used to infer climate. Remember that we found tree fern fossils in Antarctica, which told us that there were forests in Antarctica, and that tells us that Antarctica once had a climate that could support forests and support verdant ecosystems in general, as opposed to being borderline uninhabitable today, at least on land. And then we have one more direct method, ice cores. So how do ice cores work? Remember that from the glaciers unit, glaciers are formed from snow that compacts over decades or even centuries. Snow is about 90% air by volume when it first settles. It's a lot of open space. But as more snow falls on top, the snow begins to compact and less space is taken up by air. And the most compact ice is glacial ice. Only 20% of the volume in glacial ice is taken up by air, and that's a dramatic decrease. But even more importantly, the bubbles in glacial ice are not connected. The air bubbles become impermeable, and the air bubbles can't connect, the air can't escape. And this is actually how we can sample ancient air. Because in Antarctica, the air bubbles inside of glacial ice can be analyzed. A machine is used to drill down into a glacier, down to where the ice is compact enough, and the core is removed and then climate controlled so it doesn't melt. And it is relatively easy to calculate how old each layer of ice is. And as a result, the air bubbles in the ice, some of which formed thousands of years ago, can be analyzed. And the record of ice in Antarctica actually goes back thousands of years, over 800,000 years. And it's one of the most extensive climate records on Earth. It is 8 times as long as the record that's available in Greenland. And of course, the Greenland ice sheet ice cores are useful, but the ice isn't as thick there and it hasn't been accumulating for quite as long. So cores from Antarctica, especially the East Antarctic ice sheet, are very valuable for climate scientists. Ice cores are sampled from high points on glaciers. They're taken. I described glaciers as being like a dome where the snow accumulates in the center and the snow and the ice, the glaciers flow out away from the center. And what scientists want to look for are points where the ice is accumulating and where the snow is flowing away in every direction. If the snow is flowing away, that means that there's kind of too much of a buildup of it at the center. There's a lot of ice piling up, and that's where the ice is getting compacted fastest. And I mentioned that it's pretty easy to figure out how old the ice is. How do we do that? Well, we have to make some assumptions, but we have a pretty good idea of how quickly snow accumulates in Antarctica. We do have to take into account some variations, but on average, snow accumulates in Antarctica at a rate of 0.05 meters a year, or 5 centimeters a year. And that is a bit more than your fingernails grow over the course of a single year. The snow in Greenland actually accumulates faster. It accumulates at 0.5 meter or at 50 centimeters a year, and that's partially because Greenland is not quite as close to the North Pole as the East Antarctic ice sheet is to the South Pole, and it's not quite in as much of a high pressure zone. But the Greenland ice sheet is shorter, so it's not quite as useful. It is also a bit less stable in general than the East Antarctic ice sheet, and anthropogenic global warming is also causing that. Another thing to consider is that Greenland is quite close to the industrial centers of the Northern Hemisphere in Western Europe and in Russia and in North America. And it's even going to get some industrial pollution from China and East Asia. Greenland and the Arctic are in general closer to populated areas and closer to industrial centers where there's a lot of factories and a lot of mechanized transportation. And that means that the air making its way to Greenland is a bit more dominated by the influence of humanity. It's not as reliable for studying as a base for what average global temperatures or average global carbon dioxide concentrations are like. Antarctica is really far from any land, and it's quite far from any major urban areas. And so the air that reaches Antarctica is overall a bit more averaged out and a bit less dominated by the influence of people, and particularly the influence of people at industrial areas. You might have heard the term point source of pollution in an environmental science class. Like that'd be like a pipe dumping sewage into the ocean. And point sources of pollution are like factories. Antarctica is quite far from those. So this means that the air trapped in the Antarctic ice is quite useful as a stand-in for what overall worldwide global carbon dioxide concentrations are, or what global temperatures are like. And in any case, the age of the ice can be determined from the accumulation rate, or sometimes the rate of glacier flow. Now, one thing that is really important for studying ice cores is that the age of the air is not exactly the same as the ice, because the ice does not become compact enough to trap air until it has been buried to about 50 meters deep. So when scientists are figuring out how old the ice is, they need to correct for the time lag, because it's pretty easy to determine that by dividing 50 meters by whatever the accumulation rate is in a particular part of Antarctica. And that will produce an amount of time, which is a correction that needs to be added onto estimates of how old the ice is. In other words, the snow falls, and until it gets to about 50 meters depth, the air is free to come and go. Once it's buried at 50 meters depth, whatever air is there at the time gets trapped. And that's going to be sometime after the snow itself fell. The key point is that the air trapped inside of the ice is a lot younger than the ice itself. The snow, once it falls, takes time to be buried, and that can take decades or even centuries to happen, especially because the rate of accumulation in Antarctica, remember, is quite slow. Antarctica overall doesn't actually get that much precipitation, it just has time to build up and form the glaciers. The air trapped in the ice is the air from when the ice was compacted enough to become glacier ice, and not from when the snow first fell. And that's why we need this correction. So I mentioned that Antarctica is a good sort of overall, it's a good average for global, for many different types of global climate data. Ice cores can be taken from any glacier that is considered to be stable, but the ice cores taken from high points in Antarctica, especially in the East Antarctic ice sheet, provide some of the most useful and continuous data. So aside from the fact that Antarctica is far from cities and factories and transportation hubs, there's also relatively little biological activity in Antarctica. Overall, carbon dioxide and methane concentrations aren't heavily influenced by the biosphere in Antarctica compared to, say, above the Amazon rainforest. And this means that in general, the amount of carbon dioxide and CH4 in the air that's sampled in the ice cores in Antarctica, at least since the Oligocene, at least since the opening of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current and the formation of the ice sheets, it's very unaffected by biological activity. So the idea is that the air that reaches Antarctica is an average of global atmospheric concentrations. The air of Antarctica is a good sample of the world's average atmospheric conditions at a given time. And we also are really lucky to have such a long record available. We have thousands of years, and not to mention we have multiple points in Antarctica where we can get good ice cores from, and we can actually correlate samples taken from different ice cores to see how well they line up and to test the reproducibility. And reproducibility is important in science because you want your results to be something that somebody doing a completely different study could hypothetically also replicate, which shows that the idea is that this shows that the science you're coming up with is legitimate, that this isn't an accident, that this isn't something that's been engineered, that somebody could do the same study and come up with comparable results. So what scientists can do is they can take ice cores from different parts of Antarctica, and they can see if the bubbles at the same depth in different ice cores have similar carbon dioxide concentrations. And this helps us see that, for example, if there's a spike in CO2 in some air bubbles in one ice core, this helps us determine that that's not a fluke. We can look at another ice core and look at ice from the same time and see if we also observe a similar increase in carbon dioxide. And the best points to measure ice cores from come from the high points of both sheets, usually near the interior. Although we do sometimes get pretty good ice cores from near the coast as well, because remember that we have accumulation of glaciers even near the coastline in Antarctica, which is why we have ice shelves extending out over the ocean, like you can see here. This is showing rates of glacial flow. And you do sometimes actually still get pretty good cores near the ocean, even if they don't cover quite as much time as those taken from the interior. And it is really important that we can go to different places in Antarctica and get different samples and correlate the data to see if they match up. Now, how do we obtain information about global temperatures from ice cores? There's one method that involves actually directly probing the temperature of the ice itself. Just as not all water is the same temperature, liquid water might be either cold as heck, like the Southern Ocean, or it might be boiling. Snow is also not going to be the same temperature. If you have a sample of snow taken from two different places on different days, the snow is not necessarily going to be the same temperature. Snow can be any temperature below the freezing point of water. And something interesting is that layers of snow, when piled up, function kind of like a thermos. Layers of snow on the top insulate the layers of snow on the bottom from the atmosphere, and they help them stay at the same temperature. A lot of this has to do with the high heat capacity of water in general. You do have to make corrections, but with the correction, it is possible to use what is known as the borehole temperature to make estimates about, for example, winter air temperatures at different points in time. And we can use those to make estimates about whether the winter air temperatures, we can estimate what the winter air temperatures were, and we can also correlate temperatures at the same depth from different ice cores and see how they change over the years. So on this diagram, we have a borehole temperature reading, and the useful data is all over here. This shows you that the ice doesn't change temperature that much, but you can see that as you go down, we can find how old the ice is, remember, from studying the accumulation rate. And on this particular ice core, they see the temperature drop at a time that corresponds to what is known as the Little Ice Age, a period in the second millennium AD, during which temperatures dropped quite a bit, and across the world there were crop failures. Also, very possibly the drought that I mentioned before that drove the ancestral Pueblo people out of their cities was connected to the Little Ice Age, because, as we'll talk about, colder worldwide temperatures and more glaciation is associated with drier temperatures. And we can see that as we go back, we have the temperatures rise as we go back in time to be associated with the warmest periods during this interglacial. And then we see it swing all the way back over here to correspond to the glacial period of the Ice Age. More accurately, this should say glacial period and not Ice Age. But this peak here represents the last glacial maximum. It represents when global temperatures had dropped quite a bit. And the bore temperatures are useful only to a point, because if we go down far enough in the ice, remember that in cold-based glaciers like we have in Antarctica, the glacier is more effectively heated from the bottom by the heat of the rock, by the heat of the earth, than it is by the sun. So the temperature rises here because it's getting warmed from the bedrock, and that clouds any temperature findings. So borehole temperatures are useful, but they are not quite as extensive as the other way in which we measure temperature, which is measuring isotope ratios. And one of the big ways we do this in ice cores is we look at the oxygen in the carbon dioxide that's trapped in the air bubbles, because it turns out that oxygen isotopes are extremely useful. So what is an isotope? Two isotopes of an element are two variations of that element. Elements on the periodic table are defined by the structure of the nucleus, or the core of the atoms. And specifically, what element an atom is defined by the number of protons, the positively charged subatomic particles in the nucleus. Protons repel each other because two positively charged particles are going to repel each other. So nuclei that are stable, that aren't going to spontaneously fall apart, have a combination of protons and neutrons that have no charge that stops the nucleus from spontaneously falling apart. Neutrons are sort of buffers to stop protons from repelling each other. Now, if you have a bad combination of neutrons and protons, you get a radioactive isotope. some configurations of neutrons and protons are not very stable, and that gives you radioactive isotopes. And we have talked about radioactivity a fair bit. We use radioactive isotopes to study the absolute ages of rocks. However, there are some elements like oxygen that have more than one combination of protons and neutrons that is stable. And there's two separate isotopes of oxygen that both have 8 protons but have a different number of neutrons. And these are known as two stable isotopes of the same element. Normally, one isotope is much, much, much more dominant. As you can see, more than 99% of all oxygen atoms are O16, composed of nuclei with 8 protons and 8 neutrons. However, some oxygen is O18, which is stable but less abundant, and there are still 8 protons but now 10 neutrons. And I've mentioned before that it's often the changes in the less common thing that are important, kind of like how with greenhouse gases, they make up less than 1% of the atmosphere, but minor variations in methane and carbon dioxide concentrations can have big effects on climate. And the same way our bodies can be very sensitive to the concentrations of copper, iron, and the other metals that the proteins in our bodies need to build themselves. And we often employ the ratio of the less common isotope to the more common one because the ratio between the two is more useful than looking at absolute numbers. Different samples of air might have an absolute number of oxygen atoms that are really different, scaling-wise. Orders of magnitude. You could hypothetically have one that has millions of atoms and then one that has tens of millions of atoms, and that creates problems with scaling. And it makes it hard to compare the absolute numbers of O18 versus absolute numbers of O16. But if you take the ratio, that removes the scaling problem, and that creates a more consistent and useful meter of changes in the environment. Now, isotopes often undergo what is known as fractionation or uneven sorting, when a process causes one isotope to be more heavily taken up or disposed of than the other. For example, when water evaporates or when organisms take up carbonate to create calcium carbonate shells, one oxygen isotope is taken up more heavily than the other one. And this is simply because a molecule of one isotope is going to have a slightly different mass from a molecule of the other isotope. And for example, in a process like evaporation, in which you go from having liquid to a gas that's all spread apart, which would you expect to be more taken up? The light isotope is taken up much more by evaporation, whereas a process that involves, say, liquid water or gaseous carbon dioxide being converted to carbonate, carbonate is a solid, and you might expect for the heavier isotope to be taken up a lot by that, and indeed it is. And the ratio of the isotopes is expressed with this symbol. And changes in oxygen isotopes are expressed as changes in the delta 18 value. And it's the changes in the ratio that tell us the most about climate change. Because if the ratio of, say, O18 to O16 in ocean water changes, that tells us that something is happening. That tells us that something is happening to influence the ratio. And this is something we look for in past climate records, both with carbon dioxide in ice cores, as well as with carbonate in seafloor sediments or in cave formations. And what we see is that over geologic time, processes affect the ratio of oxygen isotopes. In seawater today, for example, there's one O18 atom for every 500 O16 atoms. But we can see this ratio change over time, and that tells us that something has happened to affect seawater, to affect the oxygen isotope ratio in seawater. So for example, when seawater evaporates into water vapor in the atmosphere, the lighter isotope, unsurprisingly, is much more quick to evaporate. Also unsurprisingly, rain and snow will remove the heavy isotopes from the atmosphere. Meanwhile, when organisms like coral and snails make their shells, they take up more of the heavier isotope because the formation of solid carbonate removes the heavy isotope from the system. And you can see that this says CaCO3 barely. You can see that this shows you a number that's being, this shows you a rate at which the heavier isotope is being taken up by carbonate formation. Now, we see the fractionation of isotopes change during a glacial period. For example, we can see the oxygen isotope ratios in carbonate change when we look at the carbonate in seafloor sediments from 5,000 years ago compared to that from 10,000 years ago, assuming that we can even find those sediments and accurately determine when they're from, but that's a whole separate question. During a glacial period of an ice age, less water is available worldwide, and the climate is a lot drier because more water is locked up in the ice caps. Water evaporates from the ocean, removing light isotopes, but then the water doesn't really re-enter the water cycle. It gets very heavily locked up in the ice caps and doesn't return to the ocean. There's less melting, and you have the glaciers accumulating more, so a lot more of the lighter isotope gets locked up in the glacier. So thus, oxygen 18, the heavier isotope, becomes more abundant in the ocean during a glacial period. Less of the light isotope is being returned to seawater via melting of glaciers. And what this causes is the amount of O18 in carbonate shells to go up because there's a lot more of it present, and the marine organisms have more of it to take up. So we see carbonates have a higher amount of the heavier, less common isotope during a glacial period of an ice age. And this is something that we can see here in this diagram of O18 taken from foraminifera. Remember that benthic refers to the seafloor. These are from carbonates taken from seafloor mud. And these foraminifera have carbonate in their shells, and when they die, the carbonate stays behind. And the carbonate in these fossilized, these microscopic fossils can be analyzed to obtain the oxygen isotope ratio. And on this diagram, notice that the trend is towards a higher ratio as you go from the left, or excuse me, as you go from the right, which is older, to the left. And there's kind of a zigzag pattern. And the zigzag pattern is from the alternating period of interglacial periods, meaning less ice, and glacial periods where there's more ice. So when the percentage goes up, that means that we are in a glacial period. But when it drops down, that means we're in an interglacial period. And notice how it drops right before the present. You'll notice also that the biggest number is at the bottom, if that's confusing at all. 5 is at the bottom, 3 is at the top. And if you look very closely at the left side of this diagram, you'll notice that as we get to 0 million years, aka human times, the blue line zips up. And that is showing you that we are in an interglacial period. The seafloor sediment O18 ratio has dropped. There is less O18 found in the carbonate on the seafloor now because we are in an interglacial period and there is less ice. More of the light isotope is ending up back in the ocean, and so the amount of O18 being taken up by these marine dwelling organisms is not quite as much. And we can draw correlations between oxygen isotope ratios and surface ice temperatures. We can actually find that in areas where we can get borehole temperatures, the ice temperatures correlate with the oxygen isotope ratios of the oxygen in the molecules. And that's pretty darn cool, I think, that we can make these correlations and obtain this data that way. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we have found that the carbon dioxide levels in ice cores correlate pretty well with the isotope fluctuations that we observe. CO2 levels in ice cores are a good proxy for global air temperatures because more CO2 is going to mean more global warming. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It'll trap more infrared radiation and make for a warmer planet. And the peaks and troughs in the CO2 patterns correlate pretty well with the oxygen isotope ratios. We can trace how the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has changed over time from an ice core, and we can also follow how the oxygen isotope ratios have changed. We find that at time periods when CO2 levels go up, the isotope ratio goes down because there is less glaciation and more of the light oxygen 16 isotope to be released back into seawater. And CO2 is not the only factor in global climate. There are other greenhouse gases. We also have to consider Milankovitch cycles and plate tectonics. But CO2 is a pretty strong indicator of climate, and we see the pattern lines up quite well from the various ice cores that we take in Antarctica. So paleoclimatology is a well-developed science. It is not a perfect science, but those skeptics who claim that we don't have any idea what past temperatures have been like, or suggest that we are in a cooling period now, aren't looking at the data, quite frankly. Something else to consider is that we actually can find dust in ice cores. There's yet another proxy that can be obtained from finding dust. And this is because during glacial intervals, when it's colder, there is more dust in the ice core layers. The wind is a lot stronger when it's colder, and it's also drier. More dust gets blown up, and that's because worldwide the sea level has dropped and more water is being taken up by the ice caps. And there's just more deserts on the planet overall. More water locked up in the ice caps means less available for precipitation in more temperate areas. And thus, the world is drier and dustier, and we find more dust when there is a glacial period. And when we go from the top of an ice core to the bottom, we can actually measure how much dust is present by magnetism. Because the dust, which is airborne and it's kind of from all over the world, it's just kind of dust that's ended up in Antarctica, there's a lot of iron in it. The dust contains little iron fragments, and we can measure how much dust there is by the strength of the magnetic symbol, or the magnetic signal. And we can figure that out by electrical conductivity. More iron usually means that the ice is going to conduct electricity better. And so we can see that when the electrical conductivity leaps up, um, that correlates pretty well with oxygen isotope ratios and with carbon dioxide levels. So it is another cool little tool we can use from ice cores to study climate. So Antarctica has quite an extensive record of climate change from its ice cores, but what is happening to Antarctica as a result of climate change? That is the focus of the second half of this lecture.